Hello, world history students. This is Mrs. Politsky, and I have notes for your Middle East unit, Chapter 31, Section 4. And we're going to get into talking about conflicts in the Middle East. So, regional issues had contributed to conflicts in the Middle East because of oil revenues having been used for building up military power, the growth of Islam that has led to conflicts, and most Middle Eastern countries still do not recognize Israel's right to exist. So the Six-Day War was the result of Egyptians moving troops into the Sinai Peninsula and closing the Gulf of Aqaba, which is in this area very close to the Sinai Peninsula and the country of Israel. And so Israel attacked first when it launched airstrikes against Egypt, and not only them, but Syria and Jordan. So, in other words, they were attacking pretty much everyone around them with the exception of Lebanon. Anyway, ground troops moved in and defeated Arab forces, and Israel gained an area called the Golan Heights, which is kind of up here by the Sea of Galilee, up here in the kind of northeastern corner of the country of Israel. The Sinai Peninsula, which had belonged to previously to the Egyptians. An area known as the Gaza Strip, which is right along the Mediterranean Sea, right here where my cursor is moving. The West Bank, which is this very large area here, and the east part of Jerusalem. Okay, this all took place in 1967. At some point in time, the neighbors of Israel are going to want to regain this territory back. And so in 1973, Egypt and Syria launched an attack, which was a surprise attack on Yom Kippur. Yom Kippur being one of the most holiest days in Jewish in the Jewish religion. It's the Day of Atonement. In other words, they were going to try to win back the territory that they lost in 1967. Israel did call on the United States and its allies for support to push back the Egyptians and Syrian troops. And as a result of the United States kind of being called upon, members of OPEC, which are the oil petroleum exporting countries, declared an oil embargo on the United States and refused to sell oil to any country that supported Israel. And so what did this mean here for the United States? It meant that there were gas shortages and the price of fuel skyrocketed in comparison to like the average income of people. Think about it like this. It would be like in today's current economy, gas prices going from around $2.25 to over $5 a gallon. It had a huge impact on the pocketbooks of a lot of Americans. And I think that's the reason why OPEC kind of did this. Anyway, at some point in time, there is going to be a peace agreement between the nations of Egypt and Israel. And in 1978, Egypt formally recognized Israel, and Israel in return basically returned the Sinai Peninsula back to Egypt. This was all kind of under the watchful eye of President Jimmy Carter, and the men that were involved in signing this accord were Anwar Sadat, who you see over here on the left-hand side, and Prime Minister Menachem Begin from Israel, when they signed what is known as the Camp David Accords. This has been a lasting peace and probably one of the brighter sides of Israeli politics, in the last half a century. In 1964, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, also known as the PLO, was formed, and they pledged to destroy Israel and replace it with a Palestinian state. In 1969, Yasser Arafat became the leader of the PLO and launched a campaign of guerrilla attacks against Israel. In 1978 and again in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon in order to stop these attacks. And matter of fact, the United States sent troops into Lebanon. And there was a very sad terroristic attack that happened in the city of Beirut. There were Marines that happened to be stationed in a barracks there, and somebody had taken basically a truck bomb and drove it into the building and blew up the building, killing a lot of these Marines. So resentment of Israel and their occupation boiled over in 1987 into a rebellion called the Intifada. This is where Palestinian youth battle Israeli troops in the streets. And, everything from Molotov cocktails to throwing of rocks. Eventually, you're going to start hearing about things like suicide bombing. So it was very intense. In 1993, the PLO leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli President Yitzhak Rabin actually negotiated what was known as the Oslo Accords to end the violence, which called for the Palestinians to gradually gain control and govern areas known as the West Bank and eventually the Gaza Strip. Okay, in 1995, Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli fanatic. It's a little bit reminiscent of what happened to Mahatma Gandhi, and the idea that there were some people thought that he had given away too much, and hence that made him a target. In 2000, there was a second Intifada that began. Palestinian youths were joined by the Palestinian Security Force and Hamas, which technically is a terroristic group, sent in suicide bombers into Israel to attack citizens, and they would go on to buses or go into crowded areas. Israel sent troops into the West Bank and Gaza to kind of, gain security in these areas. In 2004, Yasser Arafat died, and Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon decided to withdraw troops from Gaza and parts of the West Bank. In 2006, Hamas, which many countries still consider to be a terroristic group, won control of the Palestinian parliament. So in a way, they become a legitimate political force in that country. In 1978, Iranians began to protest the Shah's rule, which was inspired by the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who you kind of see in the image down below here. The Shah, as we mentioned before, had used secret police through basically the 1950s and 60s and early 70s to kind of spy on those people who were kind of being rebellious. And in 1979, the Shah actually fled Iran. Part of it being the fact that there was this, movement happening, and a lot of people were being inspired by Khomeini. But the other was the fact that the Shah actually was very ill, and he had cancer, and he was looking for a place to go. As a result of the Shah leaving, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who had been living in exile in the country of France, came back to Iran, and he was able to establish an Islamic Republic. Later in 1979, Iranian revolutionaries seized the American embassy in the city of Tehran and took roughly 66 Americans hostage. There were a few more. Some were released, but for the duration of over 400 days, 66 of these hostages were held by these Iranian revolutionaries. They were eventually released in January of 1981, and part of that was because of the fact that we had a presidential election here in the United States, and the new president was inaugurated, and that happened to be Ronald Reagan. In 1990, as we mentioned before, Saddam Hussein invaded the nation of Kuwait. He accused the Kuwaitis of drilling into Iraqi oil fields and stealing what would have been Iraqi oil. The United Nations, or the UN, passed economic sanctions against Iraq, but when those failed, the United States led a coalition and launched what becomes known as the Persian Gulf War. Iraqi forces were pushed out of Kuwait, and Kuwait was eventually liberated. And this all happens at the early part of 1991, roughly February. Iraq was ordered to destroy its chemical and biological weapons, sometimes known as weapons of mass destruction, but it failed to cooperate with United Nations arms inspectors to come in and verify that they had done this. And this becomes kind of the issue as we kind of move into the 2000s. So, following the 9/11 attack, some U.S. leaders thought that Saddam Hussein posed a greater threat to the United States, and many worried that he might have those weapons of mass destruction and that he might give those to terrorists. So, in 2003, another U.S.-led coalition invaded Iraq and quickly forced Hussein out of power. Hussein went into hiding, and eventually he was captured and put on trial and executed. All right, I want to mention a few things about the history of ISIS, because this kind of fills our headlines today. One of the things that we need to know is that ISIS traces its history back to around 2004, and it used to be known as the Al-Qaeda in Iraq. The name changed in 2013, and it becomes known as ISIS, also known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. And that's the reason why we use that acronym. Sometimes you might see an acronym of ISIL, which you might see on this map down here at the bottom. And there might be some others as well, but they're all kind of the same group. Anyway, the group focused on creating an Islamic State and implementing Sharia law, which we talked about earlier. This is a strict religious code based on traditional Islamic rules and practices. And ISIS, for the most part, has a net worth back in 2014 of around $2 billion. A lot of it's coming from areas that they seized in the country of Syria, such as banks, oil refineries, and other assets there. And if you look at this map, this is a map from basically the fall of 2018. The black area is the area where ISIS actually still has territory. That area is kind of diminishing as time has gone on, but Syria is still a very unstable nation at this moment in time. Thank you very much.